Okay, so now let's get into the key activities of each process step, and outline how they are dealt with at the food corner, and see what data points are needed at each step, as we work towards our data-driven supply chain model. Supply and demand planning go hand in hand, and in the case of the food corner, supply planning would involve analyzing demand and research data about in-demand items across regions, areas and communities, as well as across periods of the year and associated seasons. This would be followed by scoping out estimated supplier capacity, and then establishing how many suppliers, if more than one is needed, would have to be onboarded in order to satisfy the scoped supply capacity. Sales and operations data would be a great input in this process, because it is the sales data from which demand insights can be extracted. The sales data feeds into the demand planning process, in order to generate supply planning insights, which then feed back into the sales process, for the purpose of business development planning, the output of which will then feed into the sourcing and procurement planning. The main inputs, from one process stage to another, are all in the form of information and information exchange. So essentially, the whole process is facilitated via data and data points, regardless of how sophisticated and unsophisticated the process of collecting, managing and exchanging this data is. What this means is that at the end of the day, the efficiency of the whole process is directly related to the availability of data extracted and available specifically within this process, as well as how this data is collected, organized, managed, exchanged and updated. The insights derived from this data will only be as accurate and as useful as the data input in this process is accurate and useful. The insights are no good if the data is no good. As they say, garbage in, garbage out, so before any insights can be extracted and possible automations can be carried out, the accuracy and usefulness of the data has to be first determined and corrected. So in the case of the food corner, you have multiple systems across the supply partners that these partners input and use to run their operations, and each account manager from facilitator and fulfiller teams can request bits of this information as inputs and outputs to their planning and execution activities and processes. Right then, so like most businesses, the food corner uses a hybrid of sophisticated system integrated data exchange processes to carry out their operations, including semi-sophisticated methods such as FTP uploads and documents syncing via the cloud, as well as unsophisticated spreadsheet input and email exchange processes. This makes the process efficient in some parts, and not so efficient in some parts. For example, some suppliers have systems that they use to track their inventory, in terms of the yield they have ready and available at any given time, to fill customer orders and deliver. Some don't, so the process of determining what stock levels they have for specific food items at any given time is manual and ad hoc. The food corner's supply chain governance process mandates that, on a weekly basis, suppliers have to update their stock levels of given items onto the food corner's database in order to have a view of the full size of orders they can potentially fill at any given time. So on a weekly basis, in the case of suppliers with unsophisticated operations, a given account manager would communicate with a supplier contact to get the required information to update stock levels. Also, seeing that sales data is a key input to the demand and supply planning processes, sales records of informal retail partners have proven to be a challenge, because in most of these businesses, along with other types of B2B customers such as caterers, many of whose businesses possess a pungent informal flavor, asking for accurate sales records is like asking how long a piece of string is, especially because they tend to be resource-strapped. It is not uncommon to sometimes have the owner's teenage son manning the store, and simply seeing it more prudent to watch social media videos, rather than to updating the sales record when customers come in and make purchases. Sure, one could argue that orders made by these informal businesses offer enough data to do predictive modeling, as a supply and demand balancing exercise, but their customer purchasing data is actually more than worthwhile, especially in the event that stock purchases on the business front do not line up with the business's actual customer purchases, where sales are slowing down and stock is piling up. An unexpected slowdown in purchases of a particular food item, in a given corner store, in a given area, at a time when such an item is typically in demand, might signal something greater that might actually start affecting the entirety of the area, or the entirety of the region, and even spread to other regions. For example, there might be misinformation spreading that a certain type of bean causes a slowdown in performance, in romantic Olympics, for men, and as such, psychographics in communities of the food purchasing and consumption profile where such a bean is a permanent feature, are starting to remove the said bean from the grocery list. It would be prudent to pick this trend up earlier, before this demand slowed down for the bean spreads to other regions, where communities with this type of profile are prominent, because this is going to have a material impact on demand forecasting, which is definitely going to have an adverse impact on the supplies of the said bean. Picking this trend up early would ensure that intervention can be undertaken to mitigate against the risk to the suppliers, such as countering the said misinformation with a targeted and aggressive below-the-line campaign, or even finding other segments to hype the bean via advertising in order to create another demand avenue. On the positive side, the planning process follows a sophisticated process, where all teams are able to see and track metrics and activities across the entire supply chain process. At any point in time, a member of the facilitating team can view which producer or farmer supplied a specific item, for a specific order fulfillment, the accepted bidding price, as well as past quality assurance reviews of their yield, as input to a supplier grading decision. A fulfiller can view the same information as input to the decision of which suppliers to select to fulfill a certain order, if that order comes from a restaurant whose purchasing quantities are growing larger and larger, and looks to be possibly becoming so successful that scaling to other locations would be the logical next step. This would mean increased business from this restaurant, so it might be worthwhile to adjust the bidding benchmarks of required items, and only accept bids from suppliers with a higher than average grading. The customer management in terms of managing end customer queries, complaints, and returns is also a well-oiled process, with customers consistently giving positive reviews about how their inquiries, complaints, and returns are handled. In fact, the process is so well-oiled that customer engagement is so high that customer product reviews eclipse the formal product reviewing process that is input to product quality assurance and supplier grading.